Icon. Hey, what's happening, African family? Uh, I hope you're all doing well. What you just saw there is Chikona dance, the warriors' dance of the Wavenda. So I thought, let me just, pay some homage to my people, to my ancestors. When I hear that sound, I feel like, I feel like the spirit of my ancestors is rising within me. You know what I mean? And so the story behind this dance is that this is how, the Venda kings used to train their warriors. This was part of the training. That dance requires strength, timing, agility, flexibility, you name it. So, I also think about it in the context of calisthenics. Maybe that's why I'm drawn to calisthenics. Who knows? But yeah, this is the dance, the warriors' dance, and it is so relevant in the context of the conversation we're having. It is necessary to get myself hyped up and prepped using that because, the conversation we're about to have is somewhat of a heavy one, discussing colonial history in depth. I gotta tell you, it's not necessarily something I enjoy doing, It is not necessarily something I enjoy doing. it is a heavy subject. So I have to get myself prepped. I have to hype myself up so that this will be a little easier. And so, family, as promised, today I will be getting into the history of colonial encroachment and colonial expansion in Africa. And of course, as I mentioned in one of the lives I did earlier, very briefly, that this is the purpose of the discussion, is to get us to understand the kind of task we have ahead of ourselves. If those who are interested in decolonization, decoloniality, and so on, you need to first understand colonialism, colonization, and coloniality. And so this is where we need to start before we start thinking about an antithesis to colonialism. We need to understand colonialism itself at a very technical level. And so today we venture in. There's a video I found which I think really expresses this, and I shared a little bit with you on this. I shared a little bit. I shared a short that was based on this video. So this is Johnny Harris. What I like about this guy and his channel and what he does when he goes into history, he actually shows you the maps. He shows you how the territories were carved up and all of that. And so that is what we're going to be getting into today. It was necessary I start with Chikona so that I can have the strength, the ancestral strength to get into this subject. I don't do this because I enjoy it. Let me be honest with you. Talking about this is a bit heavy, even for me, I must admit. But let's get into it. I hope you will find this subject to be informative and that it will assist you, as you also think about what needs to be done for the liberation and true sovereignty of our continent. So let's go into it. Let's dive into it without wasting any more time.
We need to look at something astounding that happened over the course of like 100 years. This is the final chapter, and what I think is the most mind-boggling chapter in the story of how Europe took over the world. The reason why it's so mind-boggling is because this is the part of the story where the map goes from looking like this in 1800, with Europe controlling like 35% of the world's land, to looking like this by 1914. With 84% of the Earth being controlled by the people or the descendants of the people from this once isolated continent, Europe. 84%. How on earth did this happen? A huge part of this next chapter has to do with this continent, the second largest continent on Earth, and the part of the world that the Europeans hadn't really carved up yet. So this is where the whole story comes together and shows us how technology and different ways of thinking helped these people take over the world, and in the process, shaped the world we live in today. The way that we trade, where we get our stuff, the language I'm using to speak to you right now, and most of you understand it even though you don't live anywhere near the place where it was invented. I'm telling you, this isn't far away history anymore. This is the world we currently live in. So let me show you the third and final chapter of how Europe stole the world.
Hi, my name is Mlinzi.
Another video, another set of beautiful printed maps. And I'm telling you, this is the chapter where the maps get really good. Cartography really took off. Okay, let's get up to speed on where we're at. Remember, it all started with Spain and Portugal. They ramped up this colonialism thing back around 1500, and this led them to divide the world between them until other European countries got in on it too. Then the real competition started. The Dutch created the modern corporation, which allowed them to speed all of this up. The world quickly turned into a giant marketplace, run by Europeans with boats and guns and incentives to bring profits to the shareholders back home. This is all a huge part of the story, but I'm telling you, when it comes to scale, imperialism is just getting started. And that's because Europeans are about to level up. We're gonna call this Imperialism 2.0, a new way of taking over the world, fueled mostly by technology and a rare cooperation between all of these empires. One British Prime Minister described this Imperialism 2.0 as, quote, the vulgar and bastard imperialism of irritation and aggression, of grabbing everything, even if we had no use for it.
Now, this is where we begin. This is where we begin our story. A vulgar imperialism of grabbing everything, even if we had no use for it. Interesting.
But let me tell you, if you're like me and you kind of have a low-key implicit belief that European domination was inevitable and that this was going to happen no matter what, I'm here to tell you that it almost didn't happen. That's because by the end of the 1700s, revolution was in the air. Empires were losing their colonies, starting with a group of Europeans who were done having a king and declaring independence for themselves in the late 1700s. Soon you had...
This is important to also notice. So, the United States of America was established as a British colony, right? But at some point, there was a disagreement between those in the colony and those back at home in Britain. And that's where the breakaway happened. But it was not smooth like that. If you want me to go into another video and react to a video that explains the detail of it, in depth, the different battles that were fought in this war for independence, it was not one battle that took place. It was battles, for an extended period of time. And that's why also understanding why the Europeans in America were never going to let go of that colony for anything. I mean, they knew that the land they were encroaching on belonged to some people. And I want you to relate this also to our conversation about Europe colonizing Africa. That land in the United States of America, they fought for it. They fought for it between themselves. You understand? Between Britain, the United States of America. They declared their independence from Britain. Britain didn't like that, so they sent armies to fight them. So you see, Africans, this is where it's at. And you remember last time when we were reacting to our American friend, Jackson Hinkle. He spoke about, his ancestors fought against the British Empire, to declare their independence from them. It's important. The United States of America was fought in steel and blood. They fought for that. You see that? They fought for it, tooth and nail, died and killed. That is just the reality of it. So let's take note of that, my beloved African family.
Had a bunch of Spanish colonies declaring independence. And then over here in Haiti, you had enslaved people who were organizing and rebelling against their French masters, throwing them out and starting their own country.
Now, you have to understand, there's a reason why Haiti, to this day, has been kept in a state of underdevelopment. And the West has been very violent and aggressive towards Haiti. It is because of this revolution. Because if there's one thing the European colonizers did not tolerate, was slaves revolting and rebelling, and starting up revolutions and wanting to declare independence. They did not like that. And so that's why they made sure that when they got the chance, they punish anyone who did that. I will also, like I promised you, go into the history of the battle between Italy and Ethiopia. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, the main thrust was that we need to avenge the great defeat that Italy suffered at the Battle of Adwa. You understand? I believe Menelik was the king at the time who defeated the Italians. The Italians were like, we cannot allow this to go unanswered. And they said that, this inferior people cannot defeat us, and we let it go unanswered. So you need to understand, and one of the things I want you to pay attention to is the logic of colonialism, the colonial logic. How dare you challenge us? This is what Africans you are dealing with when you are dealing with the US, the West, this is what you're dealing with. If you defeat them at any point, and that's why I believe South Africa today is still safe, because there was no real defeat of the European colonial powers in South Africa. And that's why South Africa has not been destabilized and so on. I think our politicians, made deals and concessions so that, America understands we're not trying to challenge them. We're not trying to, conquer them, defeat them, and expel them or anything like that. And so, but when you look at the Zulu nation and how at the Battle of Isandlwana, they defeated the British. But when the British came back and then they defeated the Zulu nation and conquered them, they took King Tetshwayo to the United Kingdom and imprisoned him and humiliated him and made sure that you understand you are not supposed to challenge us. That was the bottom line. In other words, to establish deterrence. Once again, I go back to that.
Empires weren't only losing their colonies. Back in Europe, one ruler even lost his head in all of this. The empires were losing their grip, and soon they were fighting with one another like never before. It was chaos, and it totally freaked these European rulers out. Are they losing their empire? Are they going to lose their reins on power? Is the era of abundance and domination coming to an end? No, we can't let this happen. So they start doing something that was kind of unheard of. Instead of fighting and competing with each other, like they've always done, the European powers start talking to each other. Their empires were in jeopardy and they needed to collaborate, find ways to share power both at home and Europe.
So you just put yourself just for a second, put yourself in the shoes of these empires. So at the same time, they are competing with each other for these territories and these colonies. But then at the same time, the indigenous people in those colonies are busy causing problems with rebellions, uprisings, revolts, and so on. So you can imagine the irritation they felt given their attitude towards the indigenous people, that these are lesser people. And how dare they? So that's why they were like, look, when we're dealing with each other, because we think of each other as equals to some degree, can we think about cooperation and collaboration in conquering these savages? Real talk, I'm not exaggerating. This is how, and you will hear as he explains further, the demeanor and the attitude that they had towards Africa and the rest of the indigenous populations of the earth.
Europe, but also on the world stage. Soon, this new culture of diplomacy and collaboration would turn to focus on the one continent that none of these European powers had carved up yet, the new imperial frontier, certainly full of resources, but not yet conquered. I mean, the maps tell the story here. The maps were like a record of what Europeans knew and didn't know about the world. I mean, this one British map from 1800s says it all. Look at this thing. Europeans were definitely familiar with Africa, especially here in the coast, where for hundreds of years they had trading posts and, of course, the Atlantic slave trade. But look how they map the interior of the continent. It literally just gives up and is like inland parts, almost entirely unknown, which is pretty rare for this time period. At this point, the Europeans had really mapped a lot of the world, but this place was off limits. It was the stuff of legend, of myths. The caption here on the map says that this interior part of Africa may be considered as absolutely unknown or completely unexplored. All we know, says the map, is that its immense and arid sands are intersected with complete collections of the most ferocious beasts and most uncivilized men.
Boom! Right there. So, you see the attitude. This is the attitude with which they approach Africa. Gotta be clear on that. And in many ways, this attitude has not changed. You know, the world can... Shahid Bosen mentions this, that, you know what, as much as the world has changed so many times over the past couple of hundreds and thousands of years, the one thing that has remained constant is Europe's attitude and approach towards Africa and Africans. They said that the interior of Africa, is occupied by ferocious beasts and the most uncivilized men. Take note of that. So this is the attitude.
That's all they know. There was a very good reason for this. The fact is that soldiers and explorers from Europe who went into this area, a lot of them didn't come home. Up to 40% died from diseases like the mosquito-borne illness malaria. So much...
Oh, I thank those mosquitoes, you know. I wish they didn't find a solution to it. Those mosquitoes were a vanguard for us, y'all. Jeez.
So that this part of the map became known as the white man's grave. Totally off limits. But that soon changed. Two giant things happen that change everything, completely redirect what Europeans can do with their mounting power. First, these two French guys are able to take the bark of this tree, which had been used for a very long time for a variety of purposes, and isolate a vital chemical called quinine. It combats malaria.
How unfortunate. That is very unfortunate that they found a way to counter the white man's grave. You know, because that was a deterrent in some sense that kept them away from the interior of the land. But then they discovered, they found a way, man. Found a way.
Major killer of Europeans in Africa. They now have a white man's shield to protect them from the white man's grave. The door is slowly creaking open. Second, this guy happens. King Leopold II. He's the king of this new country called Belgium, and it existed for like 40 years. It's kind of a minor place in Europe, nothing like these OG colonizers. So it's like 1875, and King Leopold wants to play with the big boys. He wants a colony. So he literally goes around and starts asking these major colonial powers for like some of their land. Like he goes to the OGs, Spain and Portugal, and he's like, hey guys, I know you're in decline. Can I have one of your colonies? And they're like, no. So then he goes to the British and he's like, hey guys, I know you have New Guinea. Maybe you don't have any plans for it. You could give it to me. And they're like, no, Leo, don't you realize how hard we worked to steal this land? We're not just gonna give it to you as a hand.
Yo, Leo, we worked hard to dispossess these people of this land. You think we're just gonna give it to you? So Africans, if the OG colonizers, as our friend here, Harris, tells us, told one of their own that, look, man, we can give you any of our lands. We worked too hard to get them. Africans, what makes you think they're just going to give up your lands back to you when they have such a low regard for you? You know, that they said that the interior of Africa is occupied by uncivilized men. What makes you think they're going to just give it to you like that? And also, simply because you make a moral argument. Not gonna happen.
Out. So King Leopold decides to take matters into his own hands. He turns to the map and decides this part of the map, the parts unknown, where none of the colonizers have arrived to yet, is a prime place for his colony. King Leopold sets his sight on the white man's grave. A quick reminder that this is kind of the fantasy of the Europeans who haven't explored this. In reality, at this point, Africa looks a lot more like this. But in the mind of King Leopold and other Europeans, it's a big blank canvas with unlimited possibilities. So Leopold sends explorers to like the dead center of this blank canvas. And they're armed not only with some of the latest and greatest weapons, but also with medicine that shields them from these killer tropical diseases. These Belgian explorers arrive and are able to make agreements with the locals, laying claim to this land. King Leopold now has his own little colony in the center of the white man's grave. And of course, they start mapping it. This is a map from a bunch of Belgian cartographers and explorers when they first arrive to this center part of Africa. Very little detail here at the beginning. This is 1880. They basically got this river, some of the offshoots, but they don't really know what's going on in here yet. This becomes the frame that Leopold uses to build his colony. Now, of course, this freaks the French out because they're like, hey, what's Belgium doing in Africa? Why are they exploring all this land? So they decide to send their own explorers to claim their own bit of land. After all, they've got the medicine. It's not nearly as dangerous, and the Belgians are doing it. Well, of course, now the British are waking up. They're sending people too. And even the new kid on the imperial block, Germany, is chipping in. And now suddenly, we've got a scramble on our hands.
The famous scramble for Africa. This is where it comes from. So even before the Berlin Conference of 1884, they already were scrambling, for territory in Africa.
But wait, say the European powers, let's learn from our mistakes. Instead of the old days where we always had to fight over things, in this era of revolution and warfare, remember that we're trying to be better about talking to one another? Coordinating, remember? So it's 1884, and all these big Africa-hungry European empires get together in Berlin. I mean, there's this amazing painting of just them all sitting here looking at this big, beautiful map.
Take note, Africans. These folks were competing with each other. Get that very clear. But they were like, no, wait, guys. We should have learned by now that competing with each other, and, competing in an unhealthy way really doesn't, help us in any way. And we are not going to get what we want ultimately. We just destroy each other. So they were like, look, guys, let's pause on the rivalry. Let's sit down, let's talk. Let's agree on how we can do this thing collaboratively, cooperatively. Africans, tell me though, why is this thing so difficult for you, man? Huh? Why is this thing so tough for Africans? These were not just people who are homogeneous. These are people who previously had been at war with each other. But there was a point at which they were like, no, man, for our collective benefit, let's cooperate and collaborate. So, someone tell me in the comment section, Africans, why? Ungani lento isihlula? Ukokonda mini ribalwa guy to be able to switch off that primal inclination, to just insult each other and fight with each other, and shut it down for a moment, and then think more broadly about things, and think about collaboration and cooperation. Why is it so difficult with Africans? Please, someone tell me.
which would be like an amazing activity to do until you realize what's actually happening here. You've got the Chancellor of Germany, you've got the OG colonizers Portugal explaining this place to Belgium and France and Italy, and you've even got the new country, the United States, who showed up. Kind of new to all this imperial stuff, but quickly learning how power really works on the international stage.
Quickly learning how power works on the international stage. Oh, how I wish my people would learn and understand, this thing that we have with narrow nationalism of these countries that were created by the colonialists anyway. These narrow nationalisms that we have. So proud to be Nigerian, so proud to be South African, so proud to be Botswana, so proud to be this and that. Can't see the forest for the trees. Can't see the forest for the trees. The new kid on the block, the United States of America at this time, is taking notes, learning how does power work on the international stage. Can we also allow ourselves, Africans, to learn? Switch off those primal emotions for a second and learn and observe and try to be objective. It's difficult. Try to look at it objectively and logically.
Basically, anyone in Europe who didn't have an empire yet got in now. Oh, and crucially, they didn't invite any African leaders.
Crucially, there was no discussion with y'all, the people of the land, the territory that is being carved up. None of y'all invited to the conference. Hey, but I mean, why would they invite you? They've just said this is a place full of uncivilized men.
To be clear, this painting isn't like exaggerated, like it's not a political cartoon. This is literally a bunch of European dudes in a room in Berlin in 1884 discussing and coordinating how they're going to carve up and take this continent. And they decided that there was going to be one big rule for this new scramble for Africa. No pretending. None of this only on the map fake imperialism thing that the Pope arranged for Spain and Portugal a few hundred years previous. You actually have to control the land if you're going to claim it. So they divide up the map on who gets what. They leave the conference, and they get to work. The French start moving in quickly from West Africa. The British begin taking over Sudan and expanding north from down here in South Africa to take over all of this land. The Germans really start establishing themselves here and over here. Italy starts occupying all this land up here in the north and east. And Leopold, well, he got his colony. 77 times the size of Belgium. Here it was as a blank canvas when they first started exploring in 1880. Here it is 14 years later. Little Belgium down here, giant Congo up here. The blueprint has filled out. The conquest is complete. With his new colony, King Leopold, of course, went on to do horrible things, exploiting, pillaging the resources from this place, and wreaking horrible havoc on the people. And it is horrific and it is horrendous, and I made a whole other video that kind of goes into it more. I'll link to it and go to the sources.
So Africans, the story of the Congo pains me. It makes my heart bleed for many reasons, for all that it has been put through by the European invaders, but also because, in my personal history, our history as Baraudziwa Kwamasenga, it takes us back to the Congo. I mean, my grandfather, without fail, when I asked him about our people, our history, where we come from, he always said the Congo. And so I feel some kind of way about the Congo and what these people have done there. I can't forgive it, ever. Forget about it. I will never forgive it. First, Leopold does his activities, and then after many years of pain and suffering of the people there and the land, Lumumba comes up and says now he wants to solve problems that they themselves, the Congolese, did not create, which is something Steve Biko said. In his articulation of Black consciousness, that we as Black people find ourselves having to solve problems that are not of our own creation. So Lumumba comes in and says, let me solve these problems that these people have created. And what? They take him out before he even has a chance, plunging the country deeper into chaos to this day. So, you know what? Guys, you're with this forgive and forget, move on, don't live in the past. You're on your own with that one. You can't get me in there. You understand? You can't get me in there. Because the people of the Congo have not known relief since the time of Leopold. So no, there is no moving on. There is no forgive and forget. Let's not live in the past. No, it's personal.
In the description, please. Okay. All of these empires were carving up this map, coming in, mapping it very beautifully. It's like literally the opposite of what it was. It was unknown and now it's totally known. Pillaging the resources, bringing it back home, making record profits, etc., etc. And all of this carving, it happened really fast. But wait a minute, hold on, pause. How does this make any sense? Like, it made sense when it was all like on water and there were ships and there was domination and trading ports and all of that. But this is an incredibly logistically ambitious thing to do. Like, this was actually a central question for me that led me to make this series, because I just didn't understand how these countries in a matter of a few years could completely carve up the second largest continent. Well, the answer to that question isn't that surprising. These Europeans now had a leg up. They had new tools. Remember, they had invented capitalism to make them rich. That gave them time to do science, which gave them technology that they used to make their capitalism better and more effective, more productive. This cycle repeated itself over and over and over, giving Europeans a further and further leg up technologically, until soon.
Shout out to some to our guy here who's giving us this series. Shout out to Harris. Let me get the name. Johnny Harris. Shout out for bringing us this content. It's crucial. It's crucial. I'm gonna disagree with you though on some points, but I think the information is good anyway.
They had stuff like this, a steamboat. You didn't have to worry about the wind anymore to keep going. You could just steam your way all the way up African rivers.
And the old African queen.
Or the railroad, a quick way to transport food and troops. Like, you can see this map. All of this red is either railroads that they put in or railroads that they were constructing at this time. This allowed Europeans to level up not just in Africa, but everywhere. I mean, here they are in India. The British quickly taking over this entire subcontinent of what today is India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, with this massive, complex rail system that they built basically in no time. They also invented the telegraph, which could now relay messages in a matter of minutes instead of weeks. I mean, this political cartoon really personifies how powerful this was. And of course, what we've been looking at this whole time. They made maps. Big, beautiful, juicy maps showing the geography and the people and all of.
They made maps, brothers and sisters. I have been saying repeatedly, we need to get into the habit of reading maps, looking at maps, understanding maps, and understanding their geopolitical implications. In other words, to understand the different interests that exist within those maps. So, for example, South Africa, we need to have a very careful reading of which countries have interest in South Africa, which corporations have interest in South Africa, to what extent do they have influence, in which regions do they have those interests, and what are those interests? You know what I mean? Is it mineral resources? What is it? Is it markets? You understand what I'm saying? This is all part of the strategy. If we're trying to get to some kind of winning formula, we can't just be toy-toying blindly and doing this and that. No, we need to be properly, we need to be sober And we need to understand exactly the scale of what we're dealing with.
Of the land that they had conquered. In addition to technology, these empires had also perfected the art of allying with local power holders and turning the people against each other, divide and conquer, which.
And that worked very well. And that's why to this day, I do understand those who, are against this idea of our true liberation. Our own people who constantly repeat European propaganda. I mean, you've seen it, YouTube channels, who talk about all negative things to do with Africans, who talk about just how useless Africans are and all of that, all these negative stereotypes that emerge from the European world. They're happy to repeat it. All of that propaganda. I understand, I understand. Those whose main purpose is to denigrate African leadership at every turn. I mean, look, I criticize African leadership, but me, is that I'm trying to get us to do better. But we know these are the characters who just exist as mouthpieces of white supremacy. We know who they are.
Allowed a small group of Europeans to control millions of locals. And of course, they had these. These refined killing machines that allowed small groups of European soldiers to rip through truly formidable African armies. Like, look at this painting from Sudan, where the British used their guns to slaughter 10,000 enemies with just a few hundred losses. And here this casual caption showing that these savages were now mowed down by these modern weapons of war, clearing way for civilization.
These savages were mowed down, thereby clearing the way for civilization. Again, not making it up. There it is. There in black and white and highlighted in red. That it was said that those of you who were resisting colonial expansion and encroachment, you were savages that needed to be mowed down so that we can make way for civilization. This, brothers and sisters, is the attitude, has been the attitude and remains the attitude towards Africa. So we need to understand what we're dealing with here.
Now, it wasn't this easy everywhere. Descendants of white Dutch settlers held off the British for a long time down here in South Africa. And the Ethiopians were able to hold off the Italians from conquering their land, making it the only place in Africa to never be colonized. But listen, in the midst of all this bloodshed, we have to talk about something that doesn't fit cleanly into our narrative of good versus evil. Because the presence of these Europeans in this continent also brought really positive things. Remember those French dudes that discovered the treatment for malaria? Well, that was tested in the field in French Algeria, a colony.
Now, you remember when I said, Harris and I are going to disagree somewhere. And here's the part. Oh, colonialism was brutal. It was terrible. Oh, what Leopold did in Belgium was horrific. But hey, at least we got the cure for malaria, y'all. Do you see the colonial logic? You remember when Helen Ziller said colonialism brought development? And you could argue that this is one of the Europeans, this Harris fellow, one of the Europeans who you could consider somewhat progressive. But even his reasoning, his logic, the colonial logic, he also has that thing of, no, but okay, we see colonialism, it was horrific, it was terrible, but guys, but we found the cure for malaria, guys. Now that is the kind of logic and reasoning I'm not going for. We're not going for that. Because how about we flip the tables? How about we flip the tables? Say Africa in this context was Europe, and this was happening to Europe and Europeans. And then we said, no, but look, at least we found the cure for malaria. at least we invented this or that, at least we discovered this or that because of colonialism. Do you think Europeans would find that acceptable? So why should we find that acceptable? And remember, this cure for malaria was found as a white man's shield so that they can be able to encroach further into the interior of Africa. It wasn't for the goodwill of humanity or anything like that. It was to find a way to encroach into Africa without the scare of these tropical diseases, as they call them. So no, Paris, your argument falls flat here. For me, there is no justification for the horrors of colonialism and slavery that our people were subjected to. You can make that argument for me.
It changed medicine forever, giving us our modern understanding of mosquitoes and the diseases they spread.
I'm sorry, I don't give a shit. I'm sorry, I don't give a shit.
Scramble into Africa helped push forward our understanding of health and disease and medicine. These and tons of other medical developments helped these Europeans conquer land, but it also brought innovation that we still use today that has saved countless lives.
Oh, how nice. We have saved countless lives while destroying countless lives. So, hey, it's justified. Makes sense. No.
Okay, so technology was a major defining factor, but it wasn't just technology. Once again, we see in this chapter what we saw in other chapters, that Europeans had to develop new sophisticated mental inventions that allowed this all to go down. The popular story that they were telling themselves at this time was that all civilization could be ranked according to the level of development. And look, according to this analysis, they placed themselves at the top. And they could tell themselves very easily that they were the enlightened people of the world. This new colonizing story was the most sophisticated and tantalizing yet.
Oh, the white man's burden. Oh, hi guys.
And it's one that's still kind of embedded in a lot of our brains still. That the enlightened civilization had a burden to bring civilization to the rest of the world. And for that, they kind of needed to stay on top and control. And the reason why this story was so believable and tantalizing is because at this time, it was being blended with actual real objective science that was being done by Europeans, like this guy, Charles Darwin, someone who changed the way that we think about the natural world. He just put out a book about how animals evolve into hierarchies with different capabilities and traits. Well, if that applies to all animals, then it must apply to humans themselves and their societies and their civilizations. So then they go out into the field with their maps and they start gathering observations that can...
The birth of white supremacy, ladies and gentlemen. Racism. If you want to understand, one thing I must also mention is that it's so interesting when you discuss racism, its origins among the Europeans, and how they developed it into some kind of a pseudoscience. You are labeled as the racist. You know what I mean? So my whole thing is, are you upset that I'm talking about it? Are you upset that they actually did this? They categorized humanity into these different classes and attached meaning to those things. So the definition of white and black, we didn't invent that thing. Here is where it comes from. They created it. So me talking about it and how they created it, why do I become the bad guy? This is the thing I've never understood in all my years of looking into this subject matter. This is not my first rodeo, yo. This is not new to me. I didn't start this exploration into these things here on YouTube. I've been looking into this stuff for years. And these are the things that Steve Biko was trying to explain. And that's why he said, the white man needs to learn that he's only human. The black man needs to learn that he's human. That's all Steve Biko was saying. Steve Biko was not spreading a message of hatred, as some people have tried to do. No, Steve Biko was trying to say, no, we're all humans. So why do you think you deserve better things than me? Why do you think you deserve the right to mistreat me? You see what I'm saying? Anyway.
Confirm this story, and soon they're measuring people's skulls all around the world. They're keeping notes, they're developing theories and terms, they're writing academic papers, all of this to define a pretend set of pseudoscientific ideas. The idea that we're all part of a different race, all with different natural capabilities. And that is what must explain why some people have the resources and the technology and others do not. Like the previous stories that Europeans told themselves, this one was intoxicating. Think of all the generations that passed where this story could be ingrained into the minds of the people. But again, remember that I'm not saying that these Europeans are telling themselves this story every day. We're now talking about the great-great-great-grandchildren of the original colonizers. The individual people didn't have the grand plan in mind to go carve up Africa. They were just responding to what they knew, what they'd been told was real, what they wanted to believe. It was a way of life. It was a way of thinking.
Nah, Aries, y'all need to take ownership of your shit. I ain't accepting that. I'm not accepting any apologism for anything. Apologetics for colonialism are not accepted here on this channel. However, we are thankful for the good information you are providing.
And if we think that we're somehow exempt from a similar type of mental model that we don't see but that dictates our behavior, we're tricking ourselves. I mean, listen to one of these British imperialists, Cecil Rhodes. He says, "We happen to be the best people in the world, with the highest ideals of decency and justice."
Cecil John Rhodes. We happen to be the best people in the world, with the highest ideals of decency and justice, liberty and peace. I mean, these are the people who visited incredible violence upon African people. We happen to be the best people in the world. What a joke.
Liberty and peace. And the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for humanity.
Listen to that. The colonial logic. And this colonial logic continues to drive Europe, the Western world, you understand, the US empire. They genuinely believe that they are the best people in the world. It is better for humanity for them to inhabit more of the world. Now, from an African sort of point of view, from those of us who are on the receiving end, I don't think we would agree with this whole notion. Would we? I know that some of you who have bought into European propaganda would go along with this nonsense. I'm not one of those. We, the Pan-Africanists, don't go along with this nonsense. In fact, this cancer on humanity should have remained in its little spot of land over there in the north. That's my view. Y'all should have stayed over there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Cecil has made up his mind.
Running a transportation business isn't easy. You're balancing customer calls, managing.
Okay, so let's look at the map in the early 1900s. Africa looks like this, completely carved up by European powers. Over here, the Dutch had conquered the entire Indonesian archipelago, the French completely taking over this part of Southeast Asia. But the real kingpin in all of this taking over land stuff was the British Empire. In addition to all this stuff they had in Africa, they occupied the huge Indian subcontinent. They also had a few of these important ports like Hong Kong and Singapore. I mean, I can't go over all of the stuff they took over because it's just too much. At the peak of their empire, they ruled over.
He can't even go over all of it. Remember in the beginning, they said they even took stuff they never needed.
412 million people, which was a ton for that time. Their domination had spread to almost 25% of the globe, making Britain, this rainy set of islands in Europe, the biggest empire that ever existed. In doing so, they spread their people, their ideas, their economic system, their fringe language to every corner of the world, including where I'm sitting right now, because remember, the US is just one expression of the British Empire, the branch of the empire that went on to become the most powerful country in the world, to influence how the world order would look. By 1914, Europe had successfully taken over the world. They were deathly rich compared to the rest of the globe, and their ideas, both good and bad, were deeply embedded in the international system. But suddenly, all of this technology, all this industrialization that made them so effective, turned away from conquering faraway lands and was turned on each other. Over the next 30 years, hundreds of millions of people are killed in the two most destructive wars ever, made possible by all the same things that allowed Europeans to take over the world. Sophisticated weapons and technology that Europeans are now turning on each other.
So now, the same things that they defined to have made them the most progressive people in the world, best people in the world, ultimately, those things ended up being destructive even for them. And so I think one of the things that my brother King mentioned when we did our live was that, because someone said we must copy and paste Europe. No, this is precisely why you can't copy and paste. Because they just can't seem to understand how to use good things for good. They could still find a way to use good things for bad, you know? I mean, uranium is not a bad thing, but when they split the atom and they created the atom bomb, it was something completely different, you know? Let's think about that. When we are thinking about what it means to be progressive in Africa, for, you know, to be successful, we really need to think long and hard about that. There are some things we can learn here, you know, but yeah, there are certain things we need to learn not to do that they did.
The so-called sophisticated race is now slaughtering one another on an unprecedented scale. These wars didn't do the image of the civilized Europeans any good, and Western-schooled local elites decided that they didn't want to be ruled by foreign forces anymore. They were able to rally their people around a common language and birthed national identity that didn't include being ruled by white people from some faraway continent. And they pushed the colonists out, sometimes peacefully, but most often with force. The Europeans had built this insane global project for more than 400 years, and yet they saw it crumble in a matter of decades. So, today, the map has been severely redrawn. Former colonies are now mostly independent countries. There are still a ton of weird idiosyncratic holdovers from the colonial period. I've talked about those many times, and I will continue to talk about them.
Did you hear what he said? There are many hangovers from the colonial period. You know what I mean? Yeah, we have not got rid of colonialism in our lands. And so that's why us Pan-Africanists keep talking about the need to end colonialism. Kwame Nkrumah wrote a book, Neo-Colonialism, you know, the last stand of imperialism. And he said this is the most dangerous. And I can see it's very dangerous because it happens in the context where you think you have achieved freedom and independence. And because, you know, Europeans have become adept at storytelling, crafting narratives. Many of our people, you know, believe that, wow, we have democracy now, we can vote. So, you know, we have achieved freedom. We have freed ourselves from colonialism. Not so, not in reality, only in the stories, in your head and the stories that are told, but not in the reality.
I want to finish this video and finish this series up with my last thought here, which is something that the map doesn't tell us much about. Even though all these countries became independent and they can claim their own sovereignty, their own borders, their colonizers are gone, they didn't actually. Not only were there loads of borders that were literally drawn by colonizers, I mean, see basically all of my previous work, but by the end of this, it was the Europeans that had tied the whole world up into an interconnected system that still kind of echoed the old one. The Dutch invention of the shareholder corporation didn't go away. Private companies didn't suddenly stop looking to the same far-off places to find resources, to find labor, to feed increasing demand among their people back home. And European rulers and their offspring didn't stop using their big metal guns and their technology to get what they wanted in faraway lands, occasionally talking to each other and occasionally fighting with each other. Fighting to control land, to control people, to control ideas. And perhaps most powerfully, the idea that our enlightened way was indeed the best way.
We will stand with the new leaders of Iraq as they establish a government of, by, and for the Iraqi people.
Certainly has not gone away. And yet, if it were only that simple, a simple narrative of good and bad, greedy Europeans take over the world and do anything to stay ahead.
Let me stop Harris there before he continues the colonial apologism. But anyway, brothers and sisters, there you have it. That is the story, my brothers and sisters. As we explore, the encroachment and colonial expansion, I think there's a lot we should have picked up and should have learned from this. Number one, you realize that during the colonial period, the European colonial powers were not all on the same page, per se. You know what I mean? Not all on the same page. They were rivals to some degree, but then they decided to cooperate and collaborate. But then at some point, World War I, World War II, they had odds with each other, at each other's necks. And of course, there was a time period where certain groups of Europeans were persecuted, and they were not considered to fall under this definition of white. Because remember, white is not like European. White is a whole different class. I mean, white says we are the pure. White is all things pure. Look at the definition of white. White is all things pure, godly, and all of that. And of course, black is the opposite of that. And so at some point, we know the Jews in Europe, the Irish, the Italians, at some point, they were not considered white, by the Anglo-Saxon definitions, And so you get to see this thing, but I really do get to understand that these problems of bigotry, they did not start with us. They didn't start exercising these things on us. No, they already had problems with each other. And so that's why I'm like, yo, you can't fix this mind. This mind cannot be fixed. And so as Africans, we have to think about this. Another question that comes up is, if in their rivalries and their bigotries towards each other, they could find ways to work with each other, why can't we? I mean, come on, Africans. What is it really that you have against each other? What are you really fighting about? I mean, let's think about this thing. What is it that is so deep that you can't for 1 second say, you know what, maybe let's put this emotional, primitive brain stuff to the side and try to think a bit more broadly and see the forest for the trees and think geopolitically. What would be required for us to collaborate, work together for our collective success? regardless how we feel about each other emotionally. I mean, I always say, look, man, Pan-Africanism is not necessarily about sentimentalism. Oh, why don't we love one another? Look, I don't care if you love one another or not. Collaborate and cooperate. Regionally, it makes sense. It makes sense regionally. I mean, you could find that two Africans do have genuine shared interests that if they collaborated, they could both benefit. But the petty squabbles, the petty hatred will dismantle all of that. No, my people. We need to look at the colonial playbook and learn a few things. Anyway, brothers and sisters, this has been a long one, but I really wanted to make sure that I finish this so that we can move on to the next stages. I don't want to have to keep coming back to these same things. But brothers and sisters, do tell me what you think. What do you think about what you've just seen? How, Mr. Harris here breaks down, the history of colonial expansion in Africa. Do let me know in the comments. I have found this to be quite a grueling experience going through all of this, but at the same time, it is enriching. It helps, get you to understand what took place and how, we were conquered. One of the things that you must take note of is that Berlin Conference, where they all came together. And young America, the new kid on the block, was taking notes from the OG imperialists and colonialists, as Harris puts it. Anyway, brothers and sisters, it's been a blast. Yeah, I hope I gave you some things to think about. Next time, I will be looking a little at this idea of treaties and, the so-called professed benevolence of the West. I will be bringing you into that, brothers and sisters, for you to understand why, regardless of what is written on paper by the Europeans in, all these documents, constitutions, agreements, treaties, and so on, means nothing because they will always violate that. So we're going to get into that next time. But I hope you found this enriching, brothers and sisters. Peace.